At the very outset of this debate, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to once again place on record, on behalf of my friends on these benches, and I'm sure on behalf of everybody in this House, our heartfelt and sincere condolences to the family and friends and colleagues of prison officer David Black, an innocent public servant going to work when he was brutally gunned down in cold blood by despicable criminals. And his death will leave a massive void in the lives of his wife and children that will never be filled. And we continue to think of Mrs. Black and her two children. Our thoughts and prayers are with them. And there's no doubt that Mrs. Black's call at the time of her husband's murder for no retaliation was an example of immense courage and bravery, which, as I said during the statement that was made by the Secretary of State at the time, stood in stark contrast to the darkness in the hearts of her husband's killers. So we will remember him and his colleagues and all those who have died in the service of defending Northern Ireland, and it's our duty to do all that we can to ensure, as far as possible, that this kind of violence is thwarted and defeated. Mr. Speaker, there's no doubt about the progress that has been made in Northern Ireland over the recent years. The announcement yesterday that Fermanagh would host the G8 summit next June is, as the Prime Minister said, something that would have been unthinkable. He said 20 years ago, I think unthinkable even 10 years ago. An immense opportunity for Northern Ireland to showcase its talents and the opportunities that we can provide to a worldwide audience. A momentous event, and we warmly welcome that announcement and thank the Prime Minister for taking that step. And I think, as I say, it is one of the marks of the progress that we have made. Another was the visit by Her Majesty to the Irish Republic last year, the Diamond Jubilee celebrations that took place in Northern Ireland, where for the first time in decades, I think maybe for the first time ever, Her Majesty was able to be in Belfast, to be greeted by thousands of ordinary people, and to move about in an open-top vehicle without the massive security that would normally attend any kind of event concerning Her Majesty. So again, an indication of the progress that has been made, and of course the ongoing work that happens every day at Stormont and throughout Northern Ireland, parties working together, the First and Deputy First Ministers and Ministers representing a number of parties, doing the day-to-day work of government, committed to working for and behalf of all of the people of Northern Ireland. And it's important to put on record the gains that have been made through devolution in Northern Ireland. And of course, even today, my honourable colleague, friend from East Londonderry has tabled an early day motion 752, which draws attention to other significant achievements for Belfast, for Londonderry, which is now recognised as the 4th best city in the world to visit, according to the Lonely Planet Guide. It's going to host be the UK City of Culture next year, and so on. These are immense strides forward in Northern Ireland, and I pay tribute to everyone right across the community and across all parties have played a part in bringing this progress about, and of course the successive governments as well. But Mr. Black's murder showed us that despite this progress that has been made in Northern Ireland, there remains a crazed and fanatical Republican element that are determined to try to drag our community backwards into the darkest days of the past. Just last Monday, near to my constituency, a viable explosive device, which police said was designed to kill and maim, was discovered off the Ballygomartin Road. The device was found near a local school, Spring Hill Primary School, and if it had gone off, the consequences in terms of loss of life or serious injury to innocent civilians, to school children, would have been very, very serious indeed, and the device is thought to have fallen from a vehicle belonging to its intended target, either a police officer or a soldier. So this incident, coming after the murder of David Black, shows that this is a very serious situation indeed, and we don't forget the murder last year of Constable Ronan Kerr in April 2011, and the murders, of course, of Constable Stephen Carroll in March of 2009, which came just 2 days after the killing of the two soldier sappers, Patrick Azamkar and Mark Quincy at Mazarine Barracks. All of these murders carried out by so-called dissident Republicans. And then, of course, there are the many, many attacks and incidents which are thwarted successfully by the excellent work of the police through intelligence, through cooperation with other elements of the security forces, and with the cooperation of the security forces in the Irish Republic as well. But all of these demonstrate the intent of these Republican groups and the degree of planning and greater organisation that's clearly now evident. I think, Mr. Speaker, it's sometimes easy, especially from the perspective of this side of the Irish Sea, to believe that somehow everything is sorted out, if I may put it that way, as far as Northern Ireland is concerned. But these... I'm very happy to give way, yes.
That's awfully good of the Right Honourable Member to take such an early intervention. I wonder would the Right Honourable Gentleman agree, and his colleagues agree, as I'm sure they will, prompting them, that would be very helpful indeed if the government were to sanction the publication of the inventories of the weapons decommissioned by both loyalist terrorists, because that's what they were, and Republican terrorists supervised by the Independent Decommissioning Commission. So that in fact the public, the people of Northern Ireland and indeed the United Kingdom generally, could compare what has been claimed to have been decommissioned with what we reckon is still available, perhaps out there, to dissident Republicans to carry out yet another ghastly murder. And I join him, of course, in condemning that of the prison officer and giving the greatest praise to his wonderful family for the great beacons of dignity that they have shown themselves to be.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for what she says, and she raises an issue which is something that has been raised a number of times by members from Northern Ireland and elsewhere about the decommissioning process. And I think it would be, in our view, and we have said this previously, it would be useful in terms of the process that we're engaged in for the public to know what exactly was decommissioned by the various terrorist groups in Northern Ireland. I remember meetings with the decommissioning body that I, along with honourable friends, attended, and we sought clarification as to the circumstances in which that information would eventually be released. And my understanding was that at a suitable juncture, when the entire decommissioning process was finished, that then a judgment would be made, and it was certainly the intention, I think, of General de Chastelain, who was then the chairman of the decommissioning body, that that information should be released in due course. And I think it would be helpful, as the Honourable Lady has said, for that information to be released for the reasons that she has given. And I mean, we certainly were amongst those who wanted the greatest possible transparency as far as decommissioning was concerned. Indeed, we pressed at the time for it to be made clear to the public what was being decommissioning through video evidence or photographs, and famously, of course, the Republican leadership refused to abide by that at that time, and unfortunately, as a result of their refusal to accept that reasonable argument, which was designed to reassure people in Northern Ireland that what was happening was real and sincere, it delayed the reintroduction of devolution by some considerable period because it raised doubts about the sincerity of the Republican movement. But coming on, Mr. Speaker, to the point that I was making about the fact that people can sometimes fall into the belief that everything is now sorted out and settled as far as Northern Ireland is concerned. These events and the tragic murder of David Black have served to remind everyone that massive challenges remain. And I know that the ministers that are here and the shadow ministers and others are not in that category, but it is important that what we hear today debate these issues and consider them carefully, so that we take note of the progress that has been made, but also make it clear to people in Northern Ireland that there is no complacency and there is no sense that the challenges are being underestimated. These criminals want to take the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland back to the days of death, bloodshed and mayhem. And all of us in Northern Ireland and here throughout the country are determined that they will not succeed. After the death of David Black, the First Minister said that the Assembly and the Executive will not collapse. Far from it. We are united in condemnation and reinforced in our determination to create a stable, shared and peaceful society. Mr. Speaker, the First Minister was absolutely right in his assessment. These evil people will not succeed. Such terrorism did not succeed in the past, and it will not succeed now. And it is important to make the point that the violence which was carried out in the past over 30 to 40 years was just as despicable, unnecessary and evil when it was carried out by the Provisional IRA as the violence that's carried out today by these so-called dissidents. And it is very, very important, for the sake of the victims of those murders and the violence, and I join with the Honourable Lady in saying the violence that was carried out by other groups as well on the Loyalist side, which was terrorism, all of the victims. It is important that we don't get into this mindset of somehow thinking that all of violence today is terrible, but somehow in the past it was all some kind of conflict in which there could be justifications and there were grey areas. The violence that was carried out by the Provisional IRA and others for 35 years was just as evil as the violence today. It was never justified then, and it's not justified now. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
Grateful to the right honourable member for giving way, and I entirely agree with him. I attended the remembrance service at the 25th anniversary of the Enniskillen bomb just a few days ago, and nothing could have made the point that he is making more clearly than that. The unnecessary nature of that act still lives with us today. And can I add my words to his, that we must never forget those people either.
Well, I am grateful to the honourable gentleman, and it was excellent that he and colleagues from the Northern Ireland Select Committee were able to be in Enniskillen and to join with the First Minister and other elected representatives and the families of the victims and the community in County Fermanagh on that very, very solemn occasion. And it did bring home to us, if anything did, and there are many, many reminders, and we know that we're coming up to the anniversary of the Ballykelly bombing as well in the very near future. These events serve to remind us the callous, evil and despicable nature of the violence that was carried out against the people of Northern Ireland and against the security forces. And it is, I think, worth just saying, you know, in the context of that anniversary and what happened in Enniskillen in 1987. And I remember one of those who was killed was a close personal friend of mine. That's a town where I grew up and went to school, and I knew many of the people that were involved in that incident. And to think that 25 years on, we have the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom coming to that same county and being able to announce the gathering of the world's leaders for a G8 summit in the county of Fermanagh is just a fantastic illustration of the progress, but also a fantastic vindication of the courage and steadfastness of the ordinary people who stood against terrorism and were determined that they would not succeed in tearing down the fabric of society. And I gladly give way to the honourable gentleman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the right honourable gentleman. Could I just pay tribute to the ongoing courage and the steadfastness of the people of Northern Ireland, but particularly those people who are officials in Northern Ireland. We don't quite understand that every day people, gentlemen and ladies on that side of the House, who come from Northern Ireland constituencies live with a threat. They have to go outside their house and check their car. They're never certain what's going to happen. This tension is there in their lives all the time. I hope that when they come over here, that tension lessens, but the people of Northern Ireland never get rid of it, and this House must always understand that that tension remains, and actually we want it to go, and the only way it can go is by continuing development towards peace.
The honourable gentleman, who has enormous experience, having served in Northern Ireland and helped to contribute to bringing about these peaceful circumstances that we have today, he and his colleagues who served in the armed forces, is absolutely right, and I'm grateful for his comments. And he reminds the House of the continuing issues that many people have, members of the security forces. I've had prison officers in the wake of, and I'll come on to deal with some of these issues in a short while, but members in our constituencies who have come to our offices, spoken to us, worried about their personal security, members of the police service, and of course, you're right, people who are connected in any way who may be seen by these dissident terrorists as some kind of target. All of us live daily with these kinds of threats or potential threats, and very often people will say, well, there's no specific intelligence out there that particularly indicates that any individual is at risk, but you know, we have discovered and we know from the tragic events recently that that isn't necessarily any kind of reassurance at all. So I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for his comments. The victims that we referred to earlier continue to live with the scars and wounds of the violence inflicted on them, and they'll carry those wounds to their graves. And I think that it is important that we never do forget the sacrifice of the innocent and the victims and their families and loved ones that are left behind. So, Mr. Speaker, coming on to the issue of the personal security, prison officers and their families are living every day with the threat of murder and injury hanging over their heads. And during the course of the worst of the violence in the province, more than 24 prison officers lost their lives to terrorists. And of course, this was a deliberate strategy by Republicans and Loyalists to win concessions for their prisoners serving time for terrorist-related offences. And just as the murder of those officers in the past was met with widespread and near universal revulsion in the community, so will this latest attempt to intimidate and suborn the forces of law and order. In relation to this issue of personal protection for prison officers and their family, for police officers and their families, and so on, we on these benches, Mr. Speaker, have some serious concerns about the present personal protection arrangements, the maintenance of protection equipment, for instance, in the homes and other places where members have that, members of the security forces have that, those arrangements in place. They must be robust enough to ensure the security of those who work in our prisons and in our police service. And this is an area in which the government has a duty to act. The Northern Ireland Office, the Secretary of State, oversee the home protection scheme which prison officers and police officers avail of, and they have it within their power to ensure that the fullest possible protection is afforded to those members of the security forces and the prison service, and I would encourage them to do everything in their power in that regard. I'll give way to the right honourable gentleman.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. On this point, is he aware that under the special scheme in Northern Ireland, I accept this is mainly a devolved matter, but nevertheless it does touch on national security issues, the SPED scheme, SPED scheme, that at the moment we have prison officers, police officers and others who've had to leave their family home and move to alternative accommodation, who are being seriously disadvantaged because the value of their home has reduced significantly since they purchased it at the height of the property boom, and now they face the prospect of losing a lot of money. And ought we not to be looking at ways of compensating those people who, through no fault of their own, due to a security threat, now find themselves out of their home and facing a substantial loss?
Well, the right honourable gentleman raises a very, very important issue, which I know has been raised in the context of the Northern Ireland Assembly. I know that the Minister for Social Development, whose department administers the SPED scheme in Northern Ireland, has also been looking at this issue, whereby, as he rightly points out, members of the security forces told that they have to move, and the criteria for qualifying under the SPED scheme, I mean, these criteria are quite high. It's quite high threshold. So people are only granted it in the most extreme circumstances where their life may be in danger, but they find themselves in a situation where they may be in negative equity and so on. This is a problem not of their creating. And one of the issues more widely to do with the SPED scheme that I have been concerned about for some time has been the fact that the money then that is spent on the SPED scheme actually comes out of the housing budget in Northern Ireland. And I think that really is something that needs to be looked at. The SPED measure is a security-related measure, and therefore I think needs to be looked at in that context rather than being seen as a part of a housing issue. But on the specific issue the right honourable gentleman has raised, this matter has been, I think, the subject of some discussion between the Minister of Justice, the Chief Constable and the Minister of Social Development, and it's certainly an issue I think that we need to continue to raise on behalf of our constituents. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
Thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. The SPED scheme is a scheme that very clearly is outlaid to help those who are in particular trouble. As a result of the tragic murder of David Black, a number of prison officers from my constituency came to see me who were worried about the SPED scheme, and perhaps in the response that government will give, they can perhaps outline first of all that the SPED system and scheme can be sped up. In other words, it can work faster, it can work exactly to the time scale that the people need, and secondly, can there some consideration be given to those people who have to move out of their houses quickly to go to other houses, and the cost factor that is in that there to buy a new house and a mortgage that you don't already have? There's a lot of things in the SPED scheme that need to be sorted out. Perhaps maybe government can give us some response on that today. Thank you.
Well, the honourable gentleman is right to raise this because these are real practical outworking and consequence of the current security situation in Northern Ireland. And this hasn't just been an issue that has arisen in the last number of weeks. It isn't just an issue that has arisen following the tragic murder of David Black. This has been an issue for some considerable time because people have been told by the police about security issues, and indeed, as the honourable gentleman from Beckenham referred to, members of this House have also been spoken to about personal security issues as well, and for obvious reasons we're not going to go into the detail of that, but these are serious issues. But for people who are finding themselves in that position and therefore having to move house, having to qualify under the SPED scheme to have their house purchased and to move, if there are financial consequences of that, it is entirely wrong. It is entirely wrong that those people should find themselves put into that terrible financial position when their lives are at risk, and they find themselves in that position through the fault of terrorists and through no fault whatsoever of themselves. Mr. Speaker, I know of a number of prison officers who have actually been told that they qualify for the Prison Service's own protection scheme and measures, but who have been refused other protection offered by the NIO and by the Northern Ireland Executive. And clearly there is an issue here, and I would seek the reassurance from the Secretary of State, which I'm sure she will be able to give the House, that there is no question of any kind of issue regarding resources or money forming any part of any decision to deny any officer of the police or member of the prison service the protection that they need to be given under any scheme which will ensure their personal security. And I think that we all agree that all of these people who do such sterling service, and we rightly pay tribute to them, but it has to go beyond just paying tribute when things happen It means taking cognizance of the concerns and acting as far as possible to avert any kind of threat against them. And of course, that applies right across the board. There are also issues which have been raised, Mr. Speaker, with me and with other colleagues about the issuing of licences to carry personal protection weapons and the refusal to renew licences for personal protection weapons to people who have legitimate and well-founded concerns about their personal security. And there has been a tendency in recent years, and I had a man in my office just a week or two ago who came to me indicating that he was under threat, had been told that, but was having his personal protection weapon licence withdrawn and finds this incomprehensible. Is being told that because he no longer is a serving member, that the threat is reduced. There's no, coming back to the point I made earlier, no specific intelligence on him about a specific threat, yet he feels under threat, he feels in danger, and he points to his neighbour, David Black, who was murdered. So you can understand how he feels in regard to this matter. And yet he is having, he's gone through all the proper processes, and he is now having to consider legal action at his own expense to try to get this minimum protection, to try to afford him peace of mind that he can sleep in his home at night. Now, I think, Mr. Speaker, these are the kind of issues which the police service in Northern Ireland need to look at very, very closely. And when these appeals, of course, on these matters are then considered by the Northern Ireland office. So therefore, the Secretary of State and the Ministers have a role in this, because these are issues of real concern to people. And it's something which the Secretary of State, I know, will want to pay very close attention to, as we have raised these concerns in the past. Now, Mr. Speaker, the people of Northern Ireland have suffered for too long as a consequence of the acts of these terrorists down through the years. And those of us who know our history know that the provisional IRA, which wreaked so much havoc in our country for so many years, started out as a splinter group. It's easy today sometimes to dismiss some of these groups that now are active as splinter groups and small groups and micro groups and all the rest of it. But that's how the Provos started out. They started out as a breakaway from the official IRA. And if we're not to condemn another generation in Ulster, then we must act swiftly and decisively now to bring these people to book. Now, a short time ago, there was an announcement, Mr. Speaker, by the Home Secretary that the threat level from dissident Republicans on the mainland here in Great Britain has been reduced from substantial to moderate. In Northern Ireland, it remains at substantial. At the time, I, from these benches, expressed the concern of many people that such an announcement may be premature, somewhat counterproductive, and that people needed reassurance, given the recent experience of intelligence reports, or the lack of them, that there would be no reduction in security, no complacency on the part of the security forces. I'd be grateful in the response that the government brings today to know whether the government has sought or received any new assessment in the wake of the murder of David Black, and whether the Secretary of State can tell the House, is the government satisfied with the current threat level assessment overall? Many people were surprised, or seemed to be taken by surprise, Mr. Speaker, by the announcement that the various dissident groups have formed together into an umbrella group, simply styling itself as the IRA, the group that claimed responsibility for the murder of David Black. Jonathan Evans, the Director General of the Security Service, in his September 2010 speech entitled "The Threat to National Security," noted that the largest dividing lines amongst the various Republican dissident terror groups at that time was based upon, and I quote, "marginal distinctions and personal rivalries." It's now clear to many of us that these marginal distinctions and personal rivalries have to some extent ceased to exist, and these groups are starting to coalesce, which is a very, very serious development indeed. I understand that in terms of this group, the IRA, that's claiming responsibility for the murder of David Black, that it appears to be made up of elements of the real IRA, elements in the Lurgan area, and others. And that certainly is very, very serious indeed. The Secretary of State, Mr. Speaker, needs to review whether the existing prescriptions which apply to the various terrorist organisations in Northern Ireland already will apply to this newly formed umbrella group, and if they do not, then they must move to do so without delay. And if it's proven that a person is involved in such terrorist activity, they should face the full rigour of the law, and should be in no doubt that they will spend a very, very long time in prison. And can I say this, Mr. Speaker, there are many people in Northern Ireland who are greatly concerned indeed when they hear of an incident and they hear certain people being arrested and questioned, and continually being questioned and arrested for similar types of offences, and unfortunately either released after a few days or when brought to trial, that there is no conviction. And yet, in the area in which they operate and in Northern Ireland generally, people are well aware of the serious threat that is posed. Now, I say this, and of course we have to be conscious of the rule of law and due process and all of that, but when we look, and this has been said to me by many of my constituents, at the efforts that are made to remove people from the United Kingdom who are here in London and elsewhere because they pose a threat to national security, many people say to me, what are the efforts that are being made in reality, really, proactively, as opposed to reactively after a terrible event has happened, to get to grips with these individuals that are known to the police, known to everyone to be involved in serious acts of terrorism and criminality and organisation of terrorist acts? Again, that's something that I believe the Secretary of State needs to address. So, Mr. Speaker, the apparent closer organisation of these dissident terror groups in Northern Ireland adds greatly to the challenges facing the police service of Northern Ireland and the security forces. And all necessary resources must be made available to the Chief Constable to combat the terrorist threat. Now, the Government previously announced in early 2011 an additional £200 million for the PSNI budget to enable the police to counteract the dissident Republican terrorist threat. And at that time, of course, the Northern Ireland Executive also provided an extra £45 million for security. That was money that was very, very gratefully received by the police, and I can assure members of the House that the funding has been absolutely critical to ensuring that more people have not been murdered at the hands of these terrorists. However, there are a range of challenges facing the police in the months ahead, and it's important that we look at those very, very briefly as we come to the end of these remarks. The Chief Constable has expressed concerns about what the next comprehensive spending review will mean for the delivery of frontline policing services. And I would urge the Government to look favourably on any request that may come in the future for additional resources beyond the block grant allocation. Now, at the present time, the Chief Constable has not made a call for that extra money, but the Government will not be surprised, or should not be surprised, if such a call is made in the future. The fact is that the circumstances faced by the police in Northern Ireland are way beyond the day-to-day challenges and problems faced by any police force in terms of regional police forces in England, Scotland or Wales. The rate of officers leaving the force is higher than anticipated. The PSNI is losing through retirement a great deal of experience and expertise in key fields such as crime investigation and counter-terrorism, which is crucial in counteracting terrorists. And as a consequence of this faster than expected retirement rate, a new recruitment campaign will be launched next year, but it will obviously take time to plug the gaps caused by the loss of senior and experienced officers. Mr. Speaker, at present a judicial review is underway into the use by the PSNI of managed services contracts, and if successful this will pose an enormous risk to the capacity of the police service. To bind the hands of the police in this regard risks, in my view, incurring massive costs and somewhere in the region of £50 to £60 million per year. Now, the PSNI have been forced into the position of having to employ agency staff, in my view, as a direct consequence of the Patton report. That report had the effect of driving years of experience and expertise out of the police and creating a massive void in talent and skills within the organisation. And the Auditor and Controller General has acknowledged that the police in Northern Ireland face a major challenge because of a loss of talent that was without precedent in any other public sector body. So, yes, I'm glad to give way.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for giving way on this point. He will be aware that there now appears to be a trend in employment practices within the PSNI, that there's an increase in resignation of officers. Now, it's not a spike yet on the chart, but there's an upward trend of officers joining, spending a few years in the service, not spending a lifetime, devoting their time, devoting their life to the career, but a few years and then getting out. And that has started to be marked on the recruitment process, and that's why there's pressure now on the service to deliver what it has to deliver for the public.
Yes, I agree with my honourable friend, and this is also coming through in local areas where we find that police officers at a senior level, I think of my own constituency in North Belfast, which has big policing challenges, not just in terms of the security threat, but also in relation to issues like having to police protests against parades and so on, and the civil disturbances that we saw over the summer. What we find increasingly is that senior police officers come into the area, they stay for a relatively short period of time. They've only started to get to know the area properly, to get to know the various personalities on all sides and begin to get a real grasp of the issues in the area, and then they're moved on somewhere else, and somebody else has to come in and start the process all over again. So the honourable gentleman is right to point to that problem, but I would want to take the opportunity also to pay tribute to officers in the police at rank and file level and at the senior level, certainly in my constituency and elsewhere in Northern Ireland, who are doing a very good job in very, very difficult circumstances. But they need to be backed up with the reassurance that whatever resources are needed to combat the threat of terrorism will be given to them, that they'll not have to scrimp and save, and because at the end of the day, people in our constituencies and our communities are entitled to the ordinary benefits of policing as well. I mean, there are serious issues arising not just out of the Troubles, but generally in terms of drugs and burglary and community police, all of these important issues, and it's right and proper that our constituents should not suffer in that regard in order to divert resources to tackling the issue of terrorism. So, I give way, yes.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for giving way. On the issue of the wider criminality in society, would he agree with me that the levels of, for example, racketeering within our communities is often much higher, simply as a result of the paramilitary backgrounds of many of those involved in the community, who, in terms of moving away from their paramilitary backgrounds, haven't actually moved away from their criminality?
Yes, the honourable lady, coming from a Belfast constituency, which I also come from, knows full well the problems that remain. She's absolutely right to point to the issues to do with criminality, of involving people who were formerly heavily engaged in paramilitary activity but haven't given up criminality. Now, it is right to point out and to note that there has been enormous progress made in that regard. There are many people who were formerly involved in paramilitary organisations who today are making efforts, genuine efforts, to move their communities forward and to get involved in genuine help for the community. But unfortunately, and it would be wrong for us to close our eyes to this, that there are others who try to have a foot in both camps. And I think it's right to get alongside and work alongside and help those who are genuine. But if there are people who are still involved and want to try to pretend they can have it both ways, then the full rigour of the law needs to come down upon them, and we can't legitimise that or validate that in any way. So, Mr. Speaker, there is no doubt that the security situation overall that pertains in Northern Ireland is a world away from what we used to debate in this House 25 years ago. There is absolutely no doubt about that. We can't ignore that. The dark days of the past have gone, but it would also be reckless to ignore the significant challenges that we face. And therefore, it's important that we debate these matters today. I look forward to hearing from the Government, and I commend